Hi. So this third series of lectures, which will focus on um, uh, a few issues that are coming out of chapters 2 and 3 of Grammatology, and also I'm going to try to give some sort of preview, I think, at the end of chapter 4, which is what you're reading for this coming week, this coming Wednesday. But before I get to those things, I want to devote this first part of this third series to a question that I got via email from one of you. And it was, I think, a question coming out of a feeling of exasperation that even when one tries to watch these videos as supplements to actually reading the book, and maybe even using the supplemental materials that I've put up on Sakai, that there's still this feeling that that as much as we go over it, that it is incredibly easy to keep forgetting what this book is about, right? So I thought I'd devote this video to just trying to locate in one short clip an extended answer to the question, what is this book about again? Right. Remember that the quick answer to that question, the quick answer that we get when we just look at the title of the book is, well, it's about the science of writing. But if you remember from the very first video that I put up, it's not quite that simple, even if we stick to the title of the book itself, right? In some sense, it's probably more precise to say that it's not about the science of writing, because there is no science of writing, but rather that the book seems to be about, on first blush, the possibility and the impossibility of the science of writing. And that impossibility comes from the sort of conceptual heritage that brings with it a great deal of prejudice and uncritical presupposition regarding the distinction between speech and writing, and the privileged position that speech has over writing. Okay, and this bias or this prejudice or this let's just call it the hierarchy between speech and writing, forms a thread of continuity that Derrida, for as difficult as that first chapter is, that Derrida attempts to establish there between ancient philosophy, that's why he keeps bringing up Plato, why he keeps bringing up Aristotle, between ancient philosophy, medieval theology, I think he quotes Augustine, maybe Thomas Aquinas at one point, modern philosophy, this is why he quotes Hegel, why he quotes Heidegger, why he quotes Husserl, and also modern science. So this is why he brings up linguistics, which positions itself as a human science, okay, or a science of man, as the phrase used to go, okay. And it's along this thread of historical and disciplinary development that Derrida is saying that there is this sort of the trace of this surviving element, this privileging of speech over writing. Okay. But that doesn't quite seem urgent enough to us, I imagine, right? Like, again, coming back to the question, so what? Why do we care about this? And maybe our suspicion isn't wrong. Maybe the feeling that there has to be more to it has something to it, right? The feeling that there has to be more here if it's going to be a book relevant to our interests in this class. And so I hope some of you are beginning to sense, and if you were in class last 2 Wednesdays ago, I explicitly tried to insist on this, that the more we talk about this book, and the more we talk about the hierarchy between speech and writing, the more we work with this hierarchy, the more we, with flashes of insight and brick walls of frustration, regardless of how long we work with it, the book Derrida seems to have another agenda, right? That it's not just about writing and speech, right? That the business about this binary opposition and the deconstruction, a word I'll come back to, the deconstruction of this binary opposition, speech and writing, signified, signifier, the phone and the graphe, ologies and ographies, that the deconstruction of these oppositions is a disguise for something else. What does this business of writing disguise? What does the analysis of speech and writing and the hierarchy between them, right, the privileged position of speech over writing in all the texts Derrida surveys in chapters 1 and all the linguistics he surveys in chapter 2, all the philosophy and sciences of language he surveys in chapter 3, what do they make possible for him? What larger issues or consequences does this analysis open? Right? And so I want to say two things. First, and Derrida is explicit about this, although he's explicit in some of the trickier moments of the book, that the intervention he's making in the hierarchy between speech and writing corresponds to an intervention in the much larger binary of presence and absence, right? Presence and absence. And that presence-absence binary, the hierarchy between presence and absence, corresponds to that binary between speech and writing. Speech, presence, absence, writing. Okay, that these binaries correspond to each other. So in the deconstruction of the one, he's attempting to bring about a deconstruction of the latter, or the second as well. And actually a deconstruction of a whole set of other binaries, including the intelligible and the sensible, the signified and the signifier, and actually quite a few others too. Okay, so that's one thing that he's attempting to do. Okay. The second thing is that he's attempting to very carefully and trepidatiously construct some tools, some conceptual, critical tools that that we can collect under the name deconstruction, right? That deconstruction as a mode of reading, deconstruction as a political or rhetorical strategy, deconstruction as a philosophical position, however we understand deconstruction. That Derrida, in the process of deconstructing these binary oppositions, is also forging for himself some conceptual tools. Okay, and those conceptual tools are sort of related and almost synonymous with each other, right? Différence, okay, trace, spacing. In his work on Rousseau in chapter 5, which we'll be getting to in 2 or 3 weeks, supplementarity, text, exteriority, and writing. Okay? That these are all conceptual tools that he's reconceiving, right? Completely reimagining and reconceiving in order to become hammers and screwdrivers and you know, rulers, and you can tell I don't do much work with my hands, but you know, the carpenter's tools of deconstruction. These are the concepts that we can think of as those tools. Anyway, I saved writing for last because we're back to writing. Okay, that the deconstruction of speech and writing, that in using that in order to deconstruct the privileged relationship that presence has to absence in the same history of ideas and thought that correspond to the binary opposition between speech and writing, that nevertheless, even though we might think of speech and writing as a disguise for the critique of presence-absence, in the critique of presence-absence, he's always going to come back around to reconceptualizing writing. Okay, so writing still matters. It's not a mere disguise. It's not a mere disguise. It becomes one of the most important critical tools of deconstruction itself. Okay. Indeed, it's on focusing on the treatment of writing in some of the philosophical and scientific texts that that he's reading, right? So at the end of chapter 1, there's difficult sections on Heidegger and Hegel. In chapter 2, on Saussure and some others who have come after him. In chapter 4, on Claude Lévi-Strauss. And in chapter 5 and later on Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Derrida really begins and continues sketching out and arranging his theory and practice of deconstruction. And he does it by using as his tools and as his workbench, as it were, the very texts he's critiquing. Okay, so what do I mean by that? What do I mean by that? In a later video, I'm going to spend some time trying to unpack the concept trace, and also to show you how to make sense of it by moving through the book, right? Not so much focusing on not just focusing on and fetishizing one very difficult passage, but also attempting to stitch together all the places in which Derrida attempts to give some definition of trace, right? But so I'm going to talk about that later, but it's worth noting here, as an example of what I just said, that Derrida uses as his workbench and as the components that he will fashion into his very tools, that the workbench and the components of those tools he takes from the very texts he's critiquing, right? He doesn't just bring them into existence ex nihilo, from nothing, right? He sort of borrows them, or we might say steals them, from these other writers, and in a sort of perverse way refashions them into tools of his own. So take, for instance, Saussure's two comments about how meaning emerges. Right. Remember, from my previous video and from my lecture in class, that Saussure argues that the relationship between the signifier and the signified within the structure of the sign is arbitrary. Right. Derrida is going to agree with that point, and it's that emphasis on arbitrariness that Derrida is going to radicalize, and it's from that radicalization of that concept of arbitrariness that he's going to insist that we replace the concept sign with the concept trace. Okay, so out of arbitrariness, he gets the idea of trace. Okay, and I'll explain that in a later video how that's possible, and in a way that may be a bit more straightforward. Remember that Saussure also says that meaning emerges because there is difference between signs. Okay, that a particular sign has meaning because it is different from all other signs within within a language system. Okay, Derrida is going to push this even further, radicalize this point, and from this he's going to craft his concept of différance. Okay, so arbitrariness to trace, difference to différance. So we see that in using Saussure's oeuvre as his workbench, Derrida is actually going to construct his own concepts. Okay, I'll talk about those concepts in a later video. Excuse me. Okay, so again, to rehearse some of this, the rejection of writing, the exteriorization of writing, the deprivileging of writing to speech, is an attempt to secure and protect the presence of something. That's Derrida's argument, that whether it's in Phaedrus, whether it's in Saussure's work, whether it's in the Bible itself, right, all attempts to privilege speech, God's word, in Plato, the verbal expression of love versus a love letter. In Saussure, the study of sound images as opposed to written marks. That all of these privilegings are an attempt to secure and protect the presence of something, right? In Plato, it's the presence of an authentic affection for another person. In the Bible, it's the securement and protection of the truth of God's word, the truth of it, the goodness of it, the perfection of it, what have you. In Saussure, it's the securement and protection of how meaning itself works. Okay, and how it emerges, okay? Making meaning present so that we can study it scientifically, okay? So the rejection of writing is linked for Derrida to a securement and protection of presence, okay? Because absence, like writing, is a menace to all of these authors and writers. So in chapter 1, for all its difficulty, right, Derrida aims to show that this avoidance and debasement of writing recurs through St. Augustine, through medieval theology, through Kant, Hegel, Heidegger, Husserl, Peirce, Jacobson, and as we see in chapter 2, Saussure. Okay, and as we're going to see in Chapter 4, Claude Lévi-Strauss. I'll get to this in this next lecture, the exteriorization of writing, so inside, outside. What matters to these figures, very different in their purpose and goals and aims and styles and concepts, right? What matters to them all is the security, certainty, stability, and protection of their arguments concerning morality, existence, knowledge, beauty, etc. And to make them stable and protected within, right, some sense of presence, within some sort of argument that can really be boiled down to, well, that's just the way it is. Okay? Remember on the very first day of class, or maybe by the second day, that one of the things Derrida's book and Derrida's oeuvre allows us to do is to give ourselves some sort of grounding on which to challenge and doubt and be skeptical about any argument that really boils down to, well, that's just the way it is. Okay, that sort of lazy argumentation that is nevertheless quite persuasive in certain circles, including academic ones, not just in everyday life, right? It's that sort of mindset that deconstruction allows us to sort of enter, inhabit, desediment, challenge, and respond to in a critical and actually creative way. Okay. So I want to end by reading a little bit from a book that, for those of you who have become intrigued by Derrida and have some time where you would like to study a bit more about the consequences of Derrida's philosophy for the study of literature. This is a classic text on just that question. So Jonathan Culler's book on deconstruction, theory and criticism after structuralism. It's a fantastic book, a fantastic overview of a lot of early Derrida. Okay, early and mid Derrida. Okay, so I would really encourage you to pick that up and look at it. If you feel like you'd like to know a little bit more about what's going on there. Okay, I want to read something here that will help us, maybe, because this has been my challenge over the last several weeks. I want you to really feel the urgency of why it is so why it is so consequential for Derrida to be attacking and critiquing and deconstructing assumptions and arguments predicated upon some sort of reliance on presence. Okay, so far I don't really feel that I've adequately communicated that or performed it for you, that it can be incredibly unsettling and unnerving to try to use Derrida's logic and his concepts to actually deconstruct the things that are most valuable to us and in our own lives, things that we imbue with meaning and significance, partly because they are the things that feel most present to us. Okay, and it's precisely Derrida's work that would challenge that that presence and that importance. Okay. Although Derrida would never deny or want to rob that sort of significance or presence or feeling of presence from you, and we'll explain that maybe later in the semester. So why does the deconstruction of presence matter to us? Okay. So Jonathan Culler, this is on page 93 of his book. He writes, and I'm going to put this quote in the sort of description section under the video so you can see it there. He writes, among the familiar concepts that depend on the value of presence are, the immediacy of sensation, the presence of ultimate truths to a divine consciousness, the effective presence of an origin in a historical development, a spontaneous or unmediated intuition, the transumption of thesis and antithesis in a dialectical synthesis, the presence in speech of logical and grammatical structures, truth as what subsists behind appearances, and the effective presence of a goal in the steps that lead to it. the authority of presence, its power of valorization, structures all our thinking. The notions of making clear, grasping, demonstrating, revealing, and showing what is the case, all invoke presence. To claim, as in the Cartesian cogito, that the quote-unquote I resists radical doubt because it is present to itself in the act of thinking or doubting, is one sort of appeal to presence. If you don't know what the Cartesian cogito is, I'm sure many of you have heard of the phrase, I think, therefore I am, right? That comes from Descartes, René Descartes. And so that's what he's talking about here, that sense of I think, therefore I am, is also precisely a sense of self and self-presence that Derrida's work radically unhinges and desediments. Another is the notion that the meaning of an utterance is what is present to the consciousness of the speaker, what he or she has in mind at the moment of utterance. Okay, end quote. So that's, I mean, maybe a lot of ways, sorry, my screen shut down on me here. That's a lot of ways, there's a lot of arguments there, and a lot of, not just arguments, what does he call them? Sorry. A lot of familiar concepts or familiar spaces or familiar positions for which presence has fundamental value. Okay. And we could add all sorts of other ones. The love I have for my partner, the love I have for my family, the sense of whatever makes me feel present to myself, whatever in the world makes something, the truth of something else, seem present to me, right? Right. Whether it's my political positions, my moral positions, my taste in literature or music or sexual partners or what have you, that all of these things, right, traditionally rely upon valuing presence, right, the being there of something, and the sureness and security that the presence of it is there, right, and that if anything threatens that presence, that I'm going to react to it with hostility. It's precisely the moments where I'm going to react with hostility that Derrida is going to locate as there. That's where we have to slow down the hostile, enter into it, and really begin doing the work of deconstruction. Okay. All right, so I hope that helps a little bit. If that isn't concrete enough, I hope that we can remedy that later in the semester. Okay, in the next video, I want to then, I've said the word deconstruction and used the verb deconstruct quite a few times in this first video. And so in the next one, I want to spend some time thinking about what on earth is then deconstruction, right? If it's a mode of reading, if it's a practice, what are the steps in this practice? Okay, all right.